Good morning, everybody. We are going to be in Hebrews this morning, Hebrews chapter 5. We will sort of sneak a verse or two from chapter 4. So as long as you're in the page that has 4 and 5 on it, you'll be good. If it is your first time with us this morning, we just want to say thanks for visiting with us. We believe that church is not just a place that we attend. It's a family that we belong to, and one of the ways that we do that is periodically we have something called Welcome to Neighborhood Lunch, and basically what happens is after the service, we invite anybody who wants to come down the hallway to Classroom A. There's a little kitchenette in there, and we're going to have some food set up and a table. Just a family dinner, basically, family lunch. So if you don't have any plans and you've got you're newer to the church, you've got some questions, or just would love to make a connection, or hey, free lunch sounds good. You can come on down the hallway, and we'd love to serve you and get to know you a bit. It only takes an hour. There's no cruise. We're not going to try and sell you a timeshare in there, right? So it's really, really fast, and it's always a fun time. So we'll hope that you can join us for that. That'll be right after the service. The other thing that's going on today is at 5 o'clock we have our Thanksgiving threefold communion service, and it's been threefold communion, something we do about 3 times a year. We do one in August, one in Easter time, and so this one is always special and sort of gratitude themed. And so tonight when you come, we'll do the bread and cup together. We will share together in the love feast, which is just really a fellowship meal, a symbolic meal, a reminder of what we're going to be doing in heaven, right? And also what the Bible talks about that believers are just supposed to do all the time, right? Which is share together in a meal and in life and to point each other towards the Lord, right? That's the purpose of the family of God, one of our purposes as a church. And so we also do a thing called foot washing, which for some people is super strange. I had at least one conversation already today with somebody who said, we're going to do what? And so if you have questions about what that's all about, you can come talk to me afterwards. I love to talk about it. It's something that is a part of our family, our heritage as a Charis Fellowship, as a Grace Brethren Church. And so it's one of the ways we honor the Lord Jesus Christ is when he said in John 13, right after he washed the disciples' feet, he told them, I set for you an example for you to do the same. And so we all know that is 2 things. First, it's a symbolic command, right, that we're to serve each other, but we take that command literally as well, that there's something special that happens in foot washing. And so if you want to come on out, we would love to have you for threefold communion. There'll also be a time to sort of share testimonies of whatever the Lord's been doing in your life. It's really sort of a family atmosphere, a living room atmosphere for threefold communion, and we always glad to see folks there. So this morning in our series in Hebrews, this is going to be our last sermon in Hebrews for this year. We are going to be coming back to Hebrews in the new year, but we're going to stop this series sort of in pause. We're going to have sort of a one-off sermon next week, and then in December we'll be starting our Advent series, and then we'll be back in Hebrews sometime in the new year. But this morning I want to talk about this, sort of closing out this beginning section of Hebrews, talking about how Jesus is a greater mediator. That's a nice little tongue twister for you. Greater mediator. How many of you have ever had to be a mediator? Have you ever been a mediator in a conflict? You had 2 people that you love, or maybe 2 people that you are forced to be around, who were in conflict with each other. And you happen to be the person stuck in the middle. Isn't that just lovely? When you're the person stuck in the middle. And sometimes when we're mediating things, it's something small and insignificant. Sometimes it's something big, right? Perhaps you had to mediate a conflict in your workplace. Workplace conflicts happen, right? How many of you had to deal with workplace conflict this week? Right? This is something that just kind of happens, right? And sometimes we're caught in the middle of those things, and we are given the opportunity to help 2 people see eye to eye. Perhaps it's a family conflict. It's Thanksgiving week, everybody. Any family conflict you expect to brew up this Thursday around the Thanksgiving table, right? Those are some of the hardest ones, right? Because oftentimes in families what happens is we let an offense go unchecked. Somebody says something that was wrong, somebody does something that was wrong, and rather than seeking forgiveness, seeking reconciliation, what happens is a lot of times we let bitterness get into our hearts. And maybe there's two people, right, that are going to be across from your Thanksgiving table who need that mediation. They need somebody to be a go-between, to try and negotiate peace. Probably the most common form of relational mediation for me in my house is between two toddlers. And if you've ever been a parent of two kids about that same age, and really two kids of any age, you know that mediation is a parental skill that you have to learn. We have a 3-year-old Ezra and a 1-year-old James, and James has just recently become fully mobile, and he is on a constant adventure looking for snacks. And so if he even hears somebody walk into the kitchen, if he even hears a wrapper being opened of some, any kind, he will be running your way. And so this is great, and this is where the conflict comes, is that we have two sons that couldn't be more different when it comes to their relationship with food. Ezra is a bird. He eats basically nothing. He lives on air. We're not really sure. We're going to probably get him studied by science or something to figure out how it's possible that he can live on such little food. He just has no interest in food. And then he's obviously thriving and healthy and all that stuff. You've had that toddler in your life. They don't want to eat. And then James will eat everything in sight. So if Ezra is having a snack, inevitably James is like screaming in his face, right? And we have to mediate between the two. Jesus had some powerful things to say about mediation, right? He says in Matthew 5, verse 9, he says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Interestingly enough, when we look at our first verse in Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14, it says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. You shall be called the sons of God, Jesus, the Son of God." And what is Jesus being described as here in verse 14? What is he? He's a great high priest. What does a high priest do? I'm glad you asked. Right, the priesthood was a God-ordained position of spiritual authority under the Old Covenant, whereby Israel's sin was dealt with by a representative chosen by God. So the priest is a mediator, right? That's another word for it. The priest was and functioned as the mediator of this relationship between God and his people. The high priest's duty specifically was to make sacrifices for the people's sin once a year on the Day of Atonement. In accordance with Leviticus 16, you can go and write that down, Leviticus 16, Day of Atonement. All kinds of cool stuff to be learned there. It's like probably one of the most important chapters in the whole Old Testament, and it's one that we rarely look at because it's right in the middle of Leviticus. And so, because God is holy and good and pure, he cannot dwell with impurity. So the place where God's presence dwelt on the mercy seat was separated from the rest of the temple by a large and heavy veil, right? Or a drape, a curtain. Any of this sound familiar to some of you Sunday school people out there? And so we know that on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would ceremonially cleanse himself before entering the Holy of Holies. And then he would take the blood of the sacrifice and sprinkle it on the mercy seat to make atonement for the sins of the whole congregation, the whole of Israel, for a whole year. So, the priest is a mediator. The priest is a peacemaker. Jesus said, "Peacemakers shall be called sons of God." And I think the author of Hebrews is making all kinds of cool connections here when he says, since then we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. He's known as the Son of God because he's a peacemaker, because of what Jesus said back in the Beatitudes, right? Let us hold fast our confession. Jesus, there's something special that happens when we mediate. And this sermon is not about conflict resolution and mediation and something that we are called to do. It is something we are called to do. We had a sermon about this a couple of months ago. But it does seem like it's an opportune moment, the week of Thanksgiving, right? When we're walking into these relationships that sometimes it maybe has been a whole year, maybe 3-4 years since we've seen some of these people, and there's these opportunities, right, to be a mediator. Jesus says when you do that work from a pure heart, not trying to get people on your side, right? Not trying to be holier than thou, but just simply coming in at the heart of a servant and saying, I'm going to mediate something here because this is what Jesus did for me. Maybe there's somebody at your Thanksgiving table this week who doesn't know Jesus, right? And they need to see from you an example of what it looks like to have a life transformed by the life of Jesus. Maybe there's somebody who needs encouragement, right? And all of these peacemaking opportunities are examples to be named as sons of God, right? Because sons, I'm finding out, act like their dad. Right? I think that's the point. I think that's the point that's being made here, right? They'll know that you have a relational connection to a father when you're a peacemaker. When you put your nose into the difficult place in the family and try and broker peace. That's something your father would do. It's something that he's already done for us, right? He is a greater mediator. He's a greater mediator, and the author of Hebrews is saying through this passage that this temporary office that I just described to you, the office of the priesthood, this mediation between God's people and God, this high priesthood relationship, specifically this one guy who was allowed to go into the holy place once a year and pay for all the sins of Israel at one time, that Jesus is the fulfillment of that office. In fact, I think what he's actually saying is all of that stuff from the Old Testament was fine, but it was actually just one big, long illustration. It was all just building a language and helping us to understand what he was ultimately going to do. It was a good thing. It was a blessed thing. The law and the systems and the Word of God that the Israelites got was a blessing, but ultimately it was just a temporary measure to point to Jesus. And so let's look at the rest of the passage here. It says in verse 14, since we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. For every high priest is chosen from among men and appointed to act on behalf in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer a sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, you are a son, today I have begotten you. As he says also in another place, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. All right. So I just showed you all my cards. Don't worry, we're going to go back and we're going to look at them all individually. But here's the thing. Jesus is a greater mediator. Why is that true? That's how we're going to spend the next 15 minutes, 25 minutes or so. Okay? Why is Jesus a greater mediator? Well, it seems like the good Sunday school answer, but the book actually gives us some reasons behind why that's true. And the first one is this: he's a greater mediator because of his exalted position. Because of his exalted position. There's two things, really, that make somebody a good mediator. Okay? The first is position. The higher the authority a mediator works from, the better ability they have to affect change in a relationship. Okay? So think about this. You get in trouble in school. I know. Never happened in real life. Let's just pretend. One day you got in trouble in school, right? When the teacher runs out of rope with you, when they don't have anything else they can do, what's the next thing that they can do? Right? They have some system, and depending on when it was you went to school, it was different layers of whatever. But it was basically, we're going to ratchet up the layer of position of authority and bring in the heavy guns. So the teacher calls the dean, if they had one, right? And if the dean can't figure it out, then you'll go to the principal, and then you know you're really in trouble. Right? And each layer of that getting ratcheted up, it increases the power, right, of the ability to mediate a conflict. So the first thing that helps a mediator do their job is position. Okay, we'll get into the second one in a minute. What is Jesus' position from which he mediates the covenant? Well, verse 14 already told us. We have a high priest who passed through the heavens. Now, when I first read that for the first little bit, I was thinking passed through the heavens like he came down from heaven, right? Was born, and he passed through the heavens in that sense. But what's clear upon closer reading and study is that what's being referred to is not Jesus coming down and becoming flesh and dwelling among us, but Jesus, after his resurrection, ascending to heaven. And in the same way the high priest entered the Holy of Holies, right, with the blood of the sacrifice, Jesus did that, but for reals. Right? Jesus did that, but times infinity, because he didn't just go into the temple, this copy and shadow of the things in heaven. He actually went through into the heavenly realm and brought his own blood as the sacrifice to pay once and for all for us. And it says, and so he passed through the heavens, and what do we know? Where is Jesus now? Sitting at the right hand of the throne of God. And later in Hebrews is going to talk about this in greater detail, about how Jesus is the mediator and Jesus is praying and interceding for us. But you can't get much higher in a sense of authority than the exalted Jesus Christ. And that's our mediator. He is above all. He has more sway than any other thing. And this is where we get caught up when we believe the authority, the fake authority of the enemy, when we should be listening to the real authority of Jesus. What matters, whose opinion about me matters most? Mine or Jesus's? Well, he's got the position. He's got the authority. A sister might try and reconcile a conflict between two brothers, but guess who has more weight? Guess who can really get things moving in that conflict? Mom, right? Because it comes with a position of authority. A coworker might try and mediate between two other coworkers, but you know, when the manager walks in, when the business owner steps in, when the CEO walks into the room, the whole conversation shifts, right? Teams of ambassadors might be sent to try and make peace happen in some foreign conflict, but guess what? One phone call from the president could do in a couple of minutes what a whole team of people couldn't do in years. Why? Because he carries with him a position of authority. Jesus is a greater mediator because of his exalted position, because of where he sits and who he is. And the fact that God sent his Son to mediate our relationship means there is nothing more important on the King of Kings and Lord of Lords royal agenda than the restoration of humanity to himself. I almost caught that on the way down. It's amazing I don't throw this thing more often. So, okay, Jesus is a greater mediator because of his relation or his position, but he's also a greater mediator because he understands our weakness. It says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every way, every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace. We may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need." It says, "For every high priest is chosen from among men and appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifice for his own sins, just as he does for the sins of the people." So he first talks about Jesus, and then he goes back and talks. He says, I can talk about this with you guys because you understand what the high priest is, who he was. Yes, he was from this exalted position, but guess what? He's also just a dude. He was somebody with skin on, and he had struggles, and he understood weakness, and he had forgetful moments, and he was tempted. So he had to give, the old high priest had to first cleanse themselves and give offerings for themselves before they could go into the Holy of Holies that once a year. But the great thing about the mediator of the high priest was that they were human. So we just said that of the two things that make a mediator a good mediator, the first is, what was it? The position, right? The authority. The second one is relationship. Second one's relationship. The better a person knows either party in mediating a conflict, the more effective the negotiation is going to be. So back to our situation, our theoretical scenario, where you got in trouble in school, and the teacher called the dean, and the dean called the principal. The only other position that they can go to that's any higher is to call your parents. Because here we have a relationship that's not just an authority, but it's somebody who's relationally close to you, right? Somebody that knows you. Parents know how to, in school, what's the worst they can do, right? They can put you on they can suspend you. I've never understood why that's a punishment for being bad at school. Your punishment is that you can't come back to school. Darn it, right? Seems backwards, but I think actually, if you think about it, the reason why that is the thing is because then ultimately they're putting your situation back into the court of justice that is your parents or whoever your guardian was, right? And you don't want to have to deal with them. And so here's the thing, right? The relationship matters when it comes to mediation. I know how to negotiate with my son in a way that nobody else does. I know why he's upset. Somebody who's in a child care situation, I don't know why he started crying, he just started crying. As a parent, right? He's sensitive about this thing. I don't know why. Just, with toddlers, it's a whole thing. You learn the cues and the things, the way to establish peace in a situation. It's just part of it. Because of relationship. And that's ultimately what this whole weakness thing is all about. That Jesus, we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness. Rather, we have a high priest who is able to sympathize with our weakness. He's sympathetic towards our weakness. Jesus, when we ask Jesus for strength, he knows why. Because he lived a life beset with weakness in his flesh. When we look at Jesus, we see strength, but that's because he continually submitted to the Father, and the Father and the Spirit was his source of strength. But he had flesh and bones that got tired and worn out, just like you and me. He experienced temptation, right? When we pray to Jesus, Lord, lead me not into temptation, but deliver me from the evil one, he knows why. Because he was tempted. And not just those 3 times in the wilderness, right? Jesus was tempted all the time. Perhaps one of the most powerful moments to talk about Jesus' experience of weakness and his experience with temptation is in the garden, right? In Matthew 26:40, that tells a story like this, that he came to the disciples and he found them sleeping, and he said to Peter, "So, could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" He said, "Watch and pray that you may not enter into," what does he say? "Temptation. For the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." So the humanity of Jesus means that we don't serve a God who looks spitefully at our weakness like a drill sergeant barking at new recruits. We serve a God who is a friend who's been there and can look at us in our weakness and say, "I know exactly what you're going through. Because I've been there. Let me help." C.S. Lewis said this once. He said, "Friendship arises out of mere companionship when 2 or more companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste which the others do not share, and which till that moment each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden." He says, this is the good part. He says, the typical expression of opening friendship would be something like this. "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." You ever made a friend like that? You like that band too? You like that food too? You think that peanut butter and jelly on a burger isn't weird? We're friends now, right? We can talk about that later. It's probably a church discipline problem, but so we become friends when we recognize we have a connection with somebody, that they have a shared experience that we didn't think anybody else shared. And Jesus, in this passage, it's saying Jesus is a friend to weak people. Hallelujah, right? He understands our weakness. So not only do we have a high and exalted mediator whose word has serious sway because he's like on the throne or at the right hand of the throne of God, but we also have a mediator who is our friend. How does this friendship and familiarity make Jesus a better mediator? Well, first of all, as the passage says, it gives us confidence. Look at verse 16. "Let us then with confidence draw near the throne of grace, we may receive mercy and find grace in our time of need." Anybody else remember house phones? A couple of you remember house phones. For some of you that don't know what I'm talking about, there used to be these phones that were plugged into the wall in our houses. How many of you still have your house phone number memorized, right? It's like permanently etched to the inside of your memory, right? 793-3015, right? I have still like latent anxiety from the house phone ringing and my mom saying, "Hey, can you go answer the phone?" Anybody else with me has phone answering anxiety because you don't know who's on the other end? And to this day, I hate phone calls, right? I'd prefer to text any day, unless it's somebody, especially if it's like a cold call scenario, right, where I just have to call this number and talk to this person. Even like I was on the phone the other day with Southwest Airlines booking plane tickets, and I forgot my son's name. Like, this is the level of like how bad the phone breaks my brain, okay? Now, you know when that doesn't happen? When I call a friend, right? There's just something different about that. It doesn't happen when I call Meredith. It doesn't happen when I call somebody that I work with, somebody I see all the time. And some of us, we have that phone anxiety about our relationship with God. Makes us nervous. We don't know what he's thinking. And we're afraid to say something wrong. That's really our problem on the phone. Like, am I going to say something stupid? And this person's going to be laughing at me. They're going to talk later to their friends about this guy they talked to on the phone and didn't know what to say, right? But we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weakness. We have a God, we have a Jesus who's on the other end of the line on our prayers. And so we can, it says, with confidence draw near to a really scary place. Like, you think answering your home phone was scary, like drawing near to God? But notice it's defined here not as this place of power and scary wrath. What is it? It's a throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and grace in times of need. He's a better mediator, right? He's a greater mediator. For time, I'm going to skip ahead to the last point. That he's a greater mediator because his sacrifice is perfect. He's a greater mediator because his sacrifice is perfect. It says, in the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Like I said at the beginning, we're entering into sort of a pause in our series, and we're going to stop and come back. When we come back in the new year, we're going to have like a whole slew of times to talk about this last line, who in the world is Melchizedek, right? But if you've ever read Hebrews, you know he's very important in the story and the sort of the argument that the author of Hebrews is making, which really puzzles a lot of us because he's this really tiny minor character in a story about Abraham in the Old Testament. So we're going to kind of skip past that because we're going to cover that in more detail later. But I want to focus in here as we close on verse 9. Being made perfect, he became a source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. And we read eternal salvation and we kind of think, oh yeah, big deal. You know, Jesus came and he died on the cross, and his blood was like that blood that the high priest took into the Holy of Holies, and it covers for our sins. And then he rose again, and he's seated at the right hand of God, and we're going to be with Jesus forever. That's eternal salvation, right? But I think what he's specifically doing here, because remember what he's doing is he's taking this familiar Old Testament picture of the priesthood that the Jewish people that were reading this book originally would have understood, and he's comparing and contrasting, right? He's saying he's a greater mediator. He's not just a high priest, he's a great high priest. And so in all of what he's been talking about so far, he's been comparing, right? He's been saying the high priest, they were a position of authority, and so they could mediate from authority. The high priest was a person just like us, so they could mediate from a person of a place of relationship, that they understand why we sin, because they sin too, and it was a sympathetic relationship. But here there's a contrast being made, saying this is a way that they're different. See, because the high priest had to enter in year after year after year with blood from the sacrifice to pay for the sins of the people. But Jesus, it says, being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation. Not annual salvation, right? That had to be renewed every year on the Day of Atonement, but permanent, eternal salvation to all who obey him. And it's not stated in these many words, but it's covered later in the book of Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 10. It says not only is it a permanent and eternal salvation that's bought, but the nature of the sacrifice was different. Hebrews 10:11 says this, under the old covenant, the priest stands and ministers before the altar day by day, offering the same sacrifices again and again. So those aren't Day of Atonement sacrifices. Those are other kinds of sacrifices. But he says, which can never take away sins, which is kind of like offensive if you're Jewish, right? What do you mean? We've been doing these sacrifices. What do you mean they don't take away sins? But he's going somewhere with it. He says, verse 12 says, but our high priest, Jesus, offered himself to God as a single sacrifice for sins, good for all time. Then he sat down in the place of honor at God's right hand. There he waits until his enemies are humbled, made a footstool under his feet. It's a direct reference to the section I skipped. It's a fun little homework assignment to go and read that section. Go read Psalm 2. Go read Psalm 110. It's all messianic prophecy stuff. And what the author of Hebrews is saying is the thing God's plan has always been was to send his son. It was always his plan to send Jesus to make a one-time sacrifice for all. And then he sits down and he waits for God to make his enemies a footstool for his feet. And that part sounds kind of weird to us until we get to know who our enemy is. And then we, like Jesus, say, I can't wait till he makes that guy a footstool for Jesus' feet. Because we serve not just because Jesus is not just our mediator, he's also our king. Right? And he rules and he reigns. And here's the thing. He's a greater mediator because his sacrifice is perfect. And his sacrifice was just that, right? It was his. It wasn't the sacrifice of some bull or some goat that gave their life in the symbol of what Jesus was going to do. It was the sacrifice that he made. It's a sacrifice that he made, experiencing all of the weakness that you and I experience on a day-to-day basis. He carried all of that to the cross. And so we serve and we have our relationship with God mediated this morning, not by what we can do, or our capacity to pray a prayer once, or by something somebody else has done for us, somebody else's prayer, somebody else trying to lead us and disciple us. Our relationship with God is mediated by Jesus himself. And he sits in a place of total authority, and he also totally gets what you're going through.